What if a quiet morning run led to something far more than either man expected? Jason Statham and Sylvester Stallone were simply going through their usual paces, unaware that this particular day would change them. It all began with a glance, a silent plea from a young girl that neither of them could ignore. In the stillness of the early morning, something didn't feel right. And when they chose to trust their gut, they uncovered a truth far more disturbing than they had bargained for. Stay with us until the end to hear what unfolded. Be sure to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon to keep up with more stories that matter. The morning was cool, and the world was just beginning to stir as Jason Statham and Sylvester Stallone jogged side by side through the city park. The rhythmic thump of their sneakers echoed softly on the paved path, blending with the chirping birds and distant laughter of children. The park, as always, was lively with the hum of early activity, families out for a walk, dogs tugging at their leashes, and fellow joggers nodding as they passed. Morning light filtered through the branches, casting long golden lines across the grass. Jason and Sylvester had kept up this morning routine for years. It wasn't just exercise. It was their space to unwind, trade jokes, and occasionally push each other just a little too hard. "You're dragging today," Sylvester said with a crooked grin, barely winded. Jason snorted and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I figured I'd let you feel fast for once. You've earned that much." They laughed and picked up speed, pushing past the familiar bend in the path. But then Jason slowed. Something had caught his eye. A little girl, alone on a bench, no older than 10. Her dress was pale yellow, neat and clean, her braids tight and carefully done. She sat unnaturally still, her hands resting in her lap as if afraid to move even a fraction. Seated beside her was a large man in a dark trench coat, a newspaper held high in front of his face, his eyes hidden behind dark lenses. His posture was calm, too calm. It was the imbalance between her stiffness and his ease that sent a cold twinge through Jason's chest. The girl's gaze met his, unwavering, wide, searching. There was no sound from her, no movement, but in her eyes was a silent urgency. And then, so subtly it might have been missed, she tucked her thumb into her palm and closed her fingers around it. Jason's pulse jumped. He'd seen that gesture before, not in everyday life, but in briefings, in documentaries, in the quiet words of detectives who worked missing persons. It was a signal, a cry for help hidden in plain sight. He eased his pace and leaned slightly toward Sylvester. "You catch that?" he murmured. Sylvester, ever alert, glanced in the same direction. "Catch what?" "The kid. She just made the signal." Sylvester's brow furrowed. The girl now sat motionless, hands folded, but her eyes still burned with that quiet terror. Jason's gut twisted. Something was wrong, very wrong. As they moved past, the man shifted, lowering his paper with measured care. He rose and reached for the girl's wrist. It wasn't rough, not overt, but it had a chilling purpose to it. The girl didn't fight. Just a brief pause, then she rose too. Jason and Sylvester stopped ahead on the path, watching. "That's not right," Jason said quietly. "No," Sylvester replied, his voice steady. "It's not." They turned just in time to see the man guiding the girl down the path, his body positioned to block her from view. Jason's jaw tightened. "We can't just stand here, we've got to follow them." Jason gave a quiet nod, his jaw set and his shoulders squared. "Let's move." They began trailing the pair, careful not to draw attention. The man strode ahead with determination, his hold on the young girl firm and unrelenting. She moved beside him, unnaturally quiet, her steps small and rigid, like a puppet being pulled along by invisible threads. As they followed at a safe distance, Jason's heart began to race. The silence from the girl was deafening. No cry for help, no attempt to pull away. Her fear was palpable, and it sent a chill through Jason. He and Stallone weaved through the crowd without causing a stir, keeping a clear line of sight on the man and the girl as they headed toward the bus stop. The man's imposing build made it difficult to see much of the girl, but every now and then Jason caught glimpses of her, each step more unsettling than the last. She wasn't stumbling, but she also wasn't walking freely. There was no question in Jason's mind. She was under the man's control. Every few paces, the man scanned his surroundings, never releasing the girl's wrist. Jason muttered under his breath, keeping his tone low. "He's pushing it." Stallone gave a small nod, eyes locked in. And she's not saying a word, not even glancing around. Something about the whole scene felt wrong. When they reached the bus stop, the man suddenly halted. His hand tightened around the girl's arm as he inspected the approaching traffic. The bus hissed to a stop, doors swinging open. The man immediately ushered the girl inside, his broad palm guiding her with an unsettling pressure on her shoulder. She was seated quickly, toward the rear of the bus. Jason caught Stallone's eye. "We're not letting them go," he said, barely audible. "No sudden moves," Stallone replied. They stepped onto the bus, tossing a few bills into the fare box, then moved quietly toward the center. The vehicle was moderately occupied. A handful of passengers were scattered throughout, an elderly woman tapping through her phone, a construction worker lost in the passing view, a teenager nodding rhythmically to music pulsing through his earbuds. The man and the girl had taken seats at the very back. Jason and Stallone split up, each settling into different rows that still allowed for a clear line of sight. Jason positioned himself at an angle, keeping one eye fixed on the rear. The girl was pressed tightly against the window. Her back was straight, her hands clenched together in her lap. Not a single movement from her except the steady rise and fall of her chest. She stared blankly ahead as if trying to vanish into the upholstery. The man sat to her side, one arm stretched casually behind her seat, though there was nothing casual about his demeanor. Jason studied the small details. The man's sunglasses were still in place, but up close, Jason could see the tension in his body, the quick darting movements of his head, the agitated tapping of his fingers against his leg. This wasn't a family outing. This was a man on edge, guarding something or someone. A few rows ahead, Stallone shifted slightly, stretching his arms in what seemed like a relaxed gesture. His voice was calm but carried just enough to reach Jason. "I'm going to try something." He rose and walked down the aisle, stopping just behind the man and the girl. Pretending to search for a place to sit, he leaned forward and smiled at the girl. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said with a warmth that sounded effortless. "That's a lovely dress. Yellow really suits you." The girl didn't flinch. For the briefest moment, Jason saw her fingers tremble. Then the man's hand tightened on her wrist, not dramatically, but enough to send a clear message. "She's quiet," the man said evenly. "We're just headed home." Stallone held his gaze for a second, then gave a slow nod, his eyes bouncing between the two. "Got it." Jason, seated nearby, watched closely as the young girl lowered her gaze, breathing in steady, shallow rhythms, her shoulders gently lifting and falling like someone holding back tears. The sight turned his stomach. That was all he needed to see. When the bus came to a halt, the man seized her arm and yanked her up before the doors even fully opened. Sylvester glanced at Jason as the two locked eyes. "They're leaving." Jason was already on his feet. So were they. They moved after the pair as the man steered the girl onto the sidewalk. The sun had dipped lower, casting long bands of shadow across the street. They were in a quieter part of town now, storefronts darkening, a few scattered cars lining the curb, narrow alleyways stretching like veins off the main road. The man didn't pause. He ducked into one of the alleys. Jason's chest tightened. "He's slipping away." Sylvester rolled his neck, steadying himself. "Then we can't afford to lose them." They quickened their steps, eyes fixed ahead. The alley swallowed them in dusk. The deeper they went, the more silence pressed around them. Then, without a word, the man stopped and turned. For the first time, he faced them. Jason and Sylvester slowed to a halt. Though the man still wore his sunglasses, the rigid set of his jaw and slight tilt of his head gave him away. He knew. He'd realized they were tailing him. The girl stood close beside him, her posture tense, arms stiff at her sides, hands quivering slightly. The alley was narrow, lit only by a street lamp in the distance that sputtered weakly. Jason stepped forward, tone calm but firm. "Hey, just checking. Everything all right here?" The man didn't answer at first. He seemed to be running some mental calculation. Then, with a scoff and a shake of the head, he replied, "And why would that be your business?" His grip on the girl's wrist hadn't loosened. It was tight, too tight. "We're just heading home. You always tail folks for fun?" Sylvester's arms crossed over his chest, making his solid frame even more imposing. "Didn't look like she wanted to come with you." The man gave a brittle laugh. "She's just quiet. Doesn't do well with strangers. Doesn't say much." Jason looked at the girl gently. "That true, sweetheart?" Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She looked like she wanted to answer, like words were trapped just behind her lips, but fear had taken hold. The man let out a breath. "Look, we don't want trouble. We've got things to do." He gave her arm another tug. "Let's go." Jason stepped in front of him. "Not so fast." The man's eyes narrowed, and his hand twitched with frustration. "Move!" Jason stayed where he was. "Just one question," Jason said quietly as he crouched slightly, his eyes level with the girl's. His voice softened. "Tell me the truth, okay? Is he really your uncle?" The girl blinked, her shoulders beginning to shake. Then she whispered, barely audible, "No." Sylvester's muscles tensed. Jason felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. The man cursed under his breath. In an instant, he jerked the girl behind him and lunged forward, trying to push past. Jason caught his arm. "Not a chance." The man fought back, twisting violently, but the tension in his face betrayed his panic. "Let me go!" Sylvester's voice came low and solid. "She said no." The girl whimpered, eyes flicking between the three men. She edged away from the one who claimed her, as if finally understanding that the two strangers weren't here to hurt her. The man's breath came harder, his free hand balling into a fist. He was cornered and knew it. He was running out of options. Then a voice slid in from the darkness. "Everything all right, boss?" Jason turned slightly, his senses snapping to alert. Two men stepped from the shadows, both large, faces unreadable. Sylvester exhaled heavily. "Perfect," he muttered. A third figure followed, bigger than the others, arms folded like a wall. "You guys lost?" he asked coldly. Jason barely glanced their way. His attention stayed on the one who still held the girl. "You sure you want to see this through?" The man smiled faintly, a flicker of arrogance flashing across his face. "I don't think you understand," Jason said quietly, his voice edged with warning. "You need to walk away." Sylvester let out a dry, knowing laugh and took a step forward, steady and deliberate. "That's not going to happen." The largest of the men who had just arrived moved closer, his shoulders squared. "Then you're making a big mistake." Jason felt his instincts tighten. He'd seen this before, the subtle shift in posture, the way the men spaced themselves to block every exit. This wasn't some lover's quarrel in the park. It was coordinated. That knowledge settled like ice in his gut. The man gripping the girl's arm gave one final jerk. "You missed your chance," he snapped. But Jason didn't wait another second. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted sharply, forcing his hand open. The girl stumbled free with a startled breath. Stallone stepped in without missing a beat, pulling her behind him with a firm but protective arm. Then the tension snapped. Chaos exploded in the alley. As soon as Jason had broken the grip, the largest man charged at Stallone, fists flying. But Stallone was ready. He shifted his weight and sidestepped cleanly, his powerful hand catching the man's wrist mid-swing and wrenching it with brutal precision. A sickening crack echoed off the brick walls. The man staggered backward, groaning in pain. Jason didn't have time to watch. The next attacker was already on him. Lean and fast, this one swung a knife in a tight arc. Jason ducked the first slash and grabbed the man's arm with both hands, twisting it until the blade dropped to the ground. Without hesitation, Jason drove his elbow into the attacker's side, knocking the breath out of him and sending him to his knees. The original man, the one who had been holding the girl, lunged again, trying to snatch her wrist. Her eyes widened, and she recoiled instinctively. But before his hand could reach her, Stallone's massive form stepped into his path. His voice was low, menacing. "Try touching her again, and you won't walk out of here." For a moment, the man faltered, uncertainty creeping across his face. Then another of his crew lunged forward, a gun suddenly gleaming in his hand. Jason saw it just as it came up. Instinct took over. He dove, slamming the man's arm upward just as the shot fired. The bullet cracked into the wall overhead. Stallone moved like thunder, delivering a vicious right hook to the gunman's jaw. The man crumpled, the weapon clattering to the ground. Jason kicked it away, sending it skidding across the pavement. Only 2 attackers were left now. Both stood frozen, nerves showing. The big one, same guy who'd tried Stallone first, recovered and charged again. This time, Stallone met him head-on. He braced himself, grabbed the man around the middle, and with a deep roar, lifted him clean off the ground before slamming him down hard onto the concrete. The air whooshed out of the man as he hit the ground, stunned and motionless. Jason turned to the last man standing, the one who had started all this. The man was trembling now, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His confidence was gone. Jason stared him down, wiping blood from his lip. "It's over," he said simply. The man glanced toward the alley's opening, maybe thinking he had one last chance to run. But before he could move, the sound of approaching sirens sliced through the air. Red and blue lights flickered at the alley's mouth. Jason let out a long breath. Finally. Uniformed officers flooded the space, weapons drawn, barking orders. Stallone raised his hands calmly and stepped back from the downed men. Jason followed suit. The girl, still shaken, stepped close to Jason, clutching the fabric of his sleeve like an anchor. Officers quickly subdued the attackers, forcing them down and locking cuffs around their wrists. A detective approached, eyeing both Jason and Stallone before turning to the girl, his voice gentler. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, mute with emotion. Jason crouched beside her, his tone soft and steady. "You're safe now." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, her body still trembling. Stallone rubbed the back of his neck, letting out a breath. "About time you showed up," Jason Statham muttered, as one of the officers threw him a sharp look. "We got a call about suspicious movement near the bus stop, then heard a gunshot. Mind explaining what happened?" Jason rose, his eyes settling on the restrained man who had tried to drag the girl away. "He grabbed her from the park. She gave us a signal. We tailed them. When we stepped in, more of his crew came out of nowhere." The detective's expression darkened as he glanced at the suspect. "We've been watching this guy for months," he said, voice low. "You two just helped us break open a case far bigger than a simple kidnapping." Sylvester Stallone met Jason's eyes. They both knew this wasn't some isolated crime. It was part of something far more sinister. The detective lifted his radio with a resigned breath. "We'll need additional units. This just became a whole different situation." Jason looked down at the young girl still clutching his sleeve. He offered her a soft, steady smile. "You're safe now. You're going home." Her voice was quiet, a little shaky, but clear. "Thank you." He nodded. "Always." As the officers began leading the suspects away, Jason and Sylvester stepped back, letting the authorities take over. The night had cooled, and the earlier tension seemed to lift with the breeze. Sylvester exhaled, shaking his head. "That went sideways real fast." Jason let out a short chuckle. "Yeah, no kidding." They stood for a moment, silently watching as the girl was gently helped toward a waiting cruiser. She paused once to look back at them, this time with something other than fear in her eyes. They remained still as the final suspects were placed into squad cars. The alleyway was now soaked in pulsing red and blue lights, throwing restless shadows on the cracked walls. Officers moved with purpose, gathering statements, securing evidence, talking to bystanders. Near one of the vehicles, the girl stood wrapped in a blanket, still trembling a little, but now surrounded by people trained to help. A detective walked over, his gaze shifting between the two men. "I don't know how you both got tangled in this mess, but I'll tell you now, you've helped bring down something big." He held up a smartphone, its screen casting a cold glow. "This guy," he said, nodding toward the suspect, "was part of a wider operation. We've been tracking a series of missing kids, and the way he moved, the method, fits the same pattern." Jason's hands balled into fists at his sides. "So this wasn't a fluke?" The detective shook his head. "Not even close. They weren't working alone, and the way they jumped when you two showed up tells me they were expecting help that never arrived." He sighed and rubbed his forehead. "We're lucky we showed up when we did." "Yeah, luck's got nothing to do with it," Sylvester said, folding his arms. "She asked for help. We just paid attention." The detective studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "Most people wouldn't have seen it. Or they'd have seen it and walked away." Jason looked toward the girl. She hadn't moved much, still holding the blanket like armor. He approached gently, not wanting to startle her. "Hey there," he said softly. "You all right?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I think so." Her words were almost a breath. Jason knelt to her level. "They'll take care of you now. Make sure you get back to where you belong." Her eyes shimmered. "I don't know if anyone's looking for me." Jason felt a tight ache in his chest. He met the detective's eyes, who nodded solemnly. "We'll figure it out. We've got ways. She'll be protected." Sylvester stepped closer, voice calm but strong. "You're not on your own anymore. Not tonight." She sniffled again, wiping at her nose. Then, after a quiet beat, she reached out and took Jason's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Anytime." The detective cleared his throat. "We need to get her checked in, and it's time to start booking the rest of them." "But you two?" The officer's lips curled into a slight smile. "You might want to head out before we rope you into a fresh stack of reports." Sylvester let out a long breath and shook his head. "Fine by me." Jason rose to his feet, casting one final look at the girl before turning to follow Stallone out. As they stepped away from the scene, the distant murmur of police radios echoed in the background. Their part was done. They had pulled her from the jaws of something terrible. Now it was up to the justice system to keep her safe. With each step away from the alley, the weight of adrenaline began to ease from their limbs, giving way to a heavy stillness. Though the flashing red and blue lights still bathed the alley behind them, the street ahead was silent, almost eerily so. Neither man spoke at first. The silence between them wasn't awkward, just full. They were still unpacking everything that had just happened. What they had seen, what they had interrupted, what they had nearly missed. This wasn't just one twisted man preying on a child. This was something wider, something darker. It had structure, a system, and they had only caught a glimpse of it. Finally, Stallone broke the quiet. "You caught what that detective said, didn't you? That guy wasn't acting alone." Jason drew a slow breath, brushing a hand down his face. "Yeah, which means there's a whole lot more of them, and a whole lot more kids." His voice was low, pained. Stallone's fists curled at his sides, his jaw locked tight. "Makes me sick just thinking about it." Jason gave a somber nod, his face grim. "And if we hadn't seen her at the park, if she hadn't made that signal?" Stallone didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew the ending that would have come. The girl would have vanished. Another face on a flyer, another statistic, fading from memory once the news cycle moved on. Jason shook his head slowly. "We can't let that happen again." Stallone stopped, turning fully toward him. "So, what are you thinking?" Jason's eyes drifted back to the alley, to the place they'd come from. The lights were still flashing. The night was still holding its breath. That was one girl, one moment we almost missed. How many more are slipping past while no one's watching? Stallone didn't reply right away. He took a long, steady breath. You want to do something about it? Jason didn't have to respond. The look in his eyes said enough. And when he met Stallone's gaze, he saw the same determination staring back. It started with a jog, a glance, a gut feeling. And now there was no way to just step away. Not after what they'd seen. Not knowing what still lurked out there. Stallone nodded once, firmly. All right, brother. Count me in. Jason gave a small smirk. I knew you'd say that. Stallone chuckled under his breath. Well, someone's got to keep your reckless self in line. They resumed walking, but now there was a different rhythm to their steps. Not as men who had stumbled into something, but as two who had chosen to walk into it willingly. They weren't wearing badges. They didn't carry legal authority. But they had something else. Eyes wide open. Hearts unwilling to ignore what others didn't want to see. Jason glanced up at the night sky, his voice steady. Next time, we don't wait. We move before it's almost too late. Stallone nodded in quiet agreement. Next time, we look before they ever have to call out. They had no map, no plan written out. But they both knew, deep in their bones, this wasn't over. Not even close. 2 weeks passed since that long night in the alley. The city rolled on as if nothing had happened. Cars moved. Crowds gathered. Life kept its rhythm. But for Jason and Stallone, the memory lingered. That moment didn't fade. It stuck. They returned to their routines, yes, but something had shifted. A seed had been planted that wouldn't let them rest. They had done what they could. The police had stepped in. The culprits were now behind bars, and the investigation had widened its reach. But for them, this wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. That morning, they returned to the park where it all began. The sun spilled warmly over the benches. Children laughed in the distance. And the world, at least for the moment, looked calm again. But now they saw things through a different lens. They understood how danger could be hidden in the most ordinary places. They'd learned to spot the overlooked details, the subtle signs others passed by. Jason adjusted the wraps around his wrists as they fell into stride on the worn path. Feels strange being back? He asked without turning his head. Sylvester let out a steady breath, giving a thoughtful nod. Yeah, I don't see it the same anymore. Jason nodded slowly. Same here. They kept running, quiet and steady, until Jason suddenly slowed to a jog, his gaze fixed ahead. There, perched on a bench beside the trail, was a face they hadn't expected to see. The girl. But she wasn't the same. The fear had lifted from her eyes, her shoulders no longer drawn tight. As they neared, she looked up and offered a smile, small but genuine. Jason and Sylvester shared a quick glance and walked toward her. She rose to her feet, a brief pause in her step before she moved forward. Hi, Mr. Jason. Hi, Mr. Sylvester. Her voice was soft but sure. Jason crouched down, bringing himself to her level. Hey there, kiddo. How have you been? She gave a little shrug, though there was a newfound ease in her posture. Better? Sylvester gave her a warm smile. Glad to hear that. She glanced at the ground, gently nudging a pebble with her shoe, then looked back up. I wanted to say thank you for what you did. Jason's voice dropped, kind and steady. You were brave that day. Really brave. She drew in a breath. I was scared. Sylvester knelt beside Jason, his presence towering but calm. Being scared doesn't mean you weren't brave, he said, his voice low and reassuring. She nodded thoughtfully, her expression brightening a little. Jason tilted his head. So, back to being a regular kid now? A small grin tugged at her mouth. Yeah, my mom's letting me take karate lessons. Sylvester let out a soft chuckle. That's perfect. Next time, nobody's gonna push you around. Her smile grew wider, and she stood with a little more confidence. Jason reached out, gently bumping her knuckles. "Take care of yourself, all right?" "Okay," she whispered. Then, without warning, she stepped forward and gave him a quick hug, and then one for Sylvester. When she stepped back, her face held something they hadn't seen in her before. A quiet light. Hope. "Bye," she said, before hurrying toward a woman waiting nearby. Jason and Sylvester stood still for a moment, watching her disappear into the crowd. Sylvester exhaled slowly, a small grin forming. "Well, that's one little warrior we won't have to worry about anymore." Jason nodded. Yeah. They turned back to the path and started jogging again. The city was still full of secrets, some buried deep beneath everyday life, waiting for someone with sharp eyes and a willing heart. But today, they'd witnessed something else. A glimpse of healing. The kind that happens when someone chooses to step in. And if they ever sensed another silent cry in the shadows, they knew exactly what they'd do. They wouldn't turn away. They'd move toward it. Sometimes just a glance is all it takes. Jason Statham and Sylvester Stallone didn't just observe something unusual, they acted, exactly when it mattered. Because real heroes don't always come in costume. Sometimes they're just the ones who refuse to look the other way. Would you? Thank you for joining us for this powerful story. If it moved you the way it moved us, take a moment to reflect on what it means to truly see those around you, to notice the quiet cries for help, and to have the courage to respond. Heroes aren't always the ones in the spotlight. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who choose not to look away. If you believe in stories that remind us of our shared humanity, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be the first to know when the next story drops. Share this with someone who might need a little hope today. We'll see you in the next one. All stories on this channel are fictional and for entertainment only. We believe in equal rights for all and aim to share messages of kindness, fairness, and dignity. Any similarities to real people or events are purely coincidental. These stories are free of political or religious intent and are designed to inspire, not to reflect or represent real-world entities.